Okay, our next speaker is Fania Oz-Salzberger, who is incredibly accomplished. She's a professor of history at the University of Haifa's Faculty of Law and Center for German and European Studies. She's also the founding director of the Posen Research Forum for Political Thought. She has held many distinguished teaching positions around the world, including at Princeton and the Rockefeller Center. She has written and edited a large number of books on liberalism, enlightenment, and civic discourse. And she also writes in popular media, opinions, and very intelligent things. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. Maybe I will remain seated since it's late and so on, if everybody can hear, see, and so on. Thank you very much for this. And thank you, Maurice Glassman, for inflicting, in your understated British way, a tremendous slap on the face of Israeli Meretz liberalism, which is exactly what you did, whether you knew it or not. But unlike other recent slaps on the face of Israeli Meretz liberalism, you are also holding out for us a very clear direction which we could follow. What is there to do? The perennial, basically socialist question, what to do? And you seem to offer a response to that, which I well appreciate, and perhaps I'll even try to engage with it a little later on. But my ticket here, and since we are getting very close to the end of this conference, and its initial byline was, what shall replace Israeli liberalism? My own contribution was structured as a possible answer. Can it be republicanism? Can republicanism, which I'll explain in a minute, be the next big thing? Maybe this is the solution. Maybe this is the solution. And in the first part, and I will not take very long, it's late and we are all tired, but I will begin by engaging with Manny Mautner's very useful opening talk, to which I responded yesterday morning more as a historian. I said, look, Manny, you know, you are blaming the 18th century for this kind of dry, inhuman liberalism. You should blame the 19th century, leave the 18th century out of it. It was much better than you think. That was the historian's response. But now I want to spell out what I deeply agree with in Manny Mautner's suggestions, and I will sum it up quickly for all of those of you who were not there, or it's been a long time since. So Israeli liberalism, says Manny Mautner, did exist from early on. It was ingrained in early Zionism, of course in Herzl and others, but it was limping, as liberalism is bound to limp, for two main faults, for two main reasons. Firstly, because it doesn't give a broader sense of the meaning of life, historical meaning, moral meaning, where are we going, what is our collective journey. Liberalism doesn't do that, because it is, this kind of liberalism at least, is atomistic. Secondly, says Manny Mautner, there is also the problem, we call it now, the logical problem, which is liberalism doesn't understand how real people live, and this was just echoed now in Maurice Glassman's presentation. Real people don't exist like that. They don't exist like John Rawls's nameless individuals behind the screen of the veil of ignorance. We are not atoms. We belong to communities, we belong to families, we have all sorts of layers of meaning and belonging. Liberalism doesn't cater for this. And when you look at these two weaknesses, it makes you wonder, I'm adding in parentheses, how come liberalism survived at all throughout the Western world and now also in parts of East Asia and so on? If it is so problematic, so encumbered by the absence of greater meaning, and by misunderstanding human nature, how did it survive? And of course, one good answer is that it survived because it never walked alone. It always walked and worked arm in arm with something else. And Professor Mauntner tells us that this something else throughout most of Israeli and Yishuv and Israeli history was the kind of benign national spirit of early Zionism that could work well with liberalism because it had a humanist element. It was a humanist nationalism, or much of Zionism was in the old days, and so they walked arm in arm until recently. But recently, Manny Mauntner tells us this engagement ceased. Of course, Zionism gave the higher meaning, Jewish nationhood gave the sense of belonging, and liberalism gave a strong sense of rule of law, institutionalism, playing by the rules, and so on and so forth. However, in recent days, because Israeli nationalism, says Mauntner, has ceased to be humanist, abandoned humanism, abandoned its commitment to the person, to the individual. You know, I'm adding here, to support this argument, is Zev Jabotinsky wrote in the very same book, 2 sentences, seems contradicting, but they are not. Bereshit haya hayachid, bereshit hayta ha'uma. In the beginning was the individual, in the beginning was the nation, but actually Jabotinskian nationalism, revisionist nationalism, at least in some of its phases, guises, allowed it. It's only when later nationalism in Israel, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, 1990s, abandoned the individual, abandoned humanism, that its partner, liberalism, found itself alone and badly limping and unable to offer an alternative because it doesn't have the sense of a higher end, a moral horizon, and a real understanding of the human need for togetherness. And then says Manny Mauntner, and I tend to agree very deeply, I have been agreeing for a long time, maybe Republican liberalism can do the job. It's a different sort of republicanism. It's not what he calls autonomy republicanism of the isolated individuals, but it is a slightly different tradition, dovetailing with liberalism. Now, let me add to this. Republican tradition is much older than liberalism. It goes all the way back to Aristotle's Politeia. Not so much to the democracy of Pericles, but to Aristotle's Politeia. It goes all the way back to those great pupils of Aristotle, the Romans, at least in their Republican era. And then it went to sleep, and it woke up in the Italian Renaissance. Machiavelli, not the famous Machiavelli of the Prince, but the other Machiavelli of the Discourses, a Republican theorist. And it goes into the great era of early modern revolutions, the Dutch Republic, the English Revolution and Republic, the English Glorious Revolution, the French, the American revolutions, taking up this, what Pocock called the Machiavellian moment, into modern era. And it walks alongside liberalism, but it's never the same. It's never the same. It walks within democracy, but it's not quite the same as democracy. Why not? Because liberalism calls not only for the rule of law, of course the rule of law, not only for separation of powers, that too, not only for constitutionalism, but also for active civic virtue. That's what Machiavelli is about. Before him, of course, the Romans, Cicero. That was the French revolutionists are about, the American founding fathers in different variants are about. Active civic virtue. And lo and behold, along comes the Zionist revolution, taking up from European nationalisms, of course, but also creating something that looks amazingly similar to the Republican tradition, although they don't really know it. They don't really know it because the Republican tradition wasn't very strong in Warsaw or even in Vienna, or in the Russian areas where the founding fathers and mothers of Zionism came from. But they did something close to the Republican tradition. Mysteriously close. They created a very active political community. The Second Zionist Congress allows women to vote, full membership. There was no state in Europe that allowed women to vote in 1897. Second Zionist Congress. In the whole wide world, only in the two provinces of mandatory provinces, British Empire provinces of South Australia and New Zealand could women vote. Nowhere else. And the Second Zionist Congress. They create a hotbed of civic engagement and debate. Early Tzionut, early Yeshuv, very different opinions, but some sense of a commonality. Sounds Republican. Very activist, sounds Republican. In Israel today, some wonderful scholars, colleagues of mine, are saying, even Ben-Gurion's mamlachtiyut, which is, I'm afraid, untranslatable, the kind of sense of general polity that Ben-Gurion wished to impose on the different political currents in the first decade of the State of Israel, this mamlachtiyut is also republicanism, although Ben-Gurion didn't know it. It's like le bourgeois gentilhomme of Molière. He speaks prose without knowing it. Speaks republicanism without knowing it. That's mamlachtiyut. I have some qualms about it. I don't want to bother you at this time. I think that mamlachtiyut was not exactly republicanism. And let me move on. What is it about this tradition of ours that is so similar to republicanism, even if it did not come from the same sources? I want to say a few things about it. First of all, it did come from the same sources. Because you see, early modern republicanism imbibed, meaning thirstily drank, from Hebrew sources and from Jewish sources. From the Tanakh, Old Testament, some more advanced thinkers from the Talmud, from Flavius, from Maimonides, of course, and a few others. They took the Tanakh, the Old Testament, to be a historical model of an ancient republic. So there was something in Hebrew and Jewish tradition that inspired modern republicanism. What was it? It was something very, very familiar to us. We don't have a name for it. That's the Jewish way of doing things, the Jewish community, the Jewish decision-making process in the shtetl, in the Jewish quarter in North African towns, the kahal, the very strong sense of legality and the inner rule of law, the shrill voices arguing but managing not to kill one another. Something deeply Jewish, also deeply Republican. They ran parallel, but early modern republicanism can be proved to have taken inspiration from Hebrew sources. So this is one thing. But the other thing, that this self-same Jewish tradition of shrill arguing without killing one another, of reaching political compromises within the community, fed into the Zionist mainstream early on. And that was, yes, that was a republic tradition minus the name Republican. But this was not exactly the Machiavellian or the Dutch or the English or the French or the American republicanism. It was different. And I would like to coin a phrase here. Our republicanism was a wet republicanism, not a dry one. It wasn't a rule of the game republicanism. It wasn't even a citizen's virtue republicanism. It was much wetter than that. And when I say wet republicanism, I know that maybe Moritz will be thinking about wet Tories, but it is much closer to blue labor than it is to the wet Tories. It is about a powerful sense of community, a truly authentic sense of community, playing out, increasingly playing out, in the broader field of a political community, a pre-state establishment, and the young state of Israel. This is what Zionism did at its best. It did some bad things too. At its best, Zionism took this powerful sense of community, its ancient habits of arguing out differences and managing to sort them and to create binding decisions for the common good. And Zionism managed to translate this Jewish Republican tradition into a state-sized polity. But unlike the kind of dry Western Republicanism, this was very wet because it was full of cultural elements, an inner code, an inner language, idiosyncrasies, Yiddishisms, you name it. You know, I'm a kibbutznik by birth and education. I was born and lived in a kibbutz until I was 20 years old. And the kibbutz was not exactly a republic, not at all. But its genome was not so far from the genome that Morris has just, may I call you Morris or should it be Baron? Morris or Baron?
Morris is really okay, between us.
Yes, just between us. We shall,
the audience, Baron.
Yes. You see, you spoke about the Bundists plus Samson Raphael Hirsch, this kind of strange concoction. Our genome was not so different from both the Bundists and Samson Raphael Hirsch. You know, when I went later in life to Australia and met some real, true blue Bundists, they were so, in Melbourne, they were so similar to my kibbutz elders, you know, minus the Zionism. Okay, so minus Zionism, who cares? They were so similar. Or when I met some ultra-Orthodox community members, they were familiar to me. Same genome. But there is a but. You see, this wet liberalism of early Zionism, the kibbutz, Mapai, Ben Gurion, it wasn't totally narrow and hegemonic. You know, there were also the religious kibbutz movement, there were the Tel Aviv urban style participants in the Zionist adventure. It wasn't very narrow. It wasn't fully hegemonic in the sense that is now put to sharp critical discourse, but it was still very much von unser, belonging to us, with our taste, with our little secret languages, with our little codes, with our familiarities. It was good enough to give people both a sense of a republic, of a common good, and a strong sense of belonging and a higher end, which liberalism does not have. But today, this wet republicanism is either dead or must be transformed because it's become far too narrow. It's become the old elites. It's become the dying Mapai hegemony. Its codes have become condescending. It's no longer a good idea to uphold the kind of kibbutz republicanism today. Even if we could and we can't, we are losing. We lost already. Except that the actual sense of a wet republicanism can be rearranged to open it up to a far broader public within the Israeli polity. When Ifat Biton in an earlier session spoke of the Levantine villa or the Levantine culture, with all those doors opening to other doors and reflecting a plethora of cultures interlocking, interacting, sometimes in tension, sometimes in dialogue. This can also fit well into a wet Republican model, extremely well. It's not only about the rules of the game. It's not only about belonging to the same intimate community. It's about intertwining belongings. I was thinking about it when an Arab friend came back from Amman the other day and said to me, do you know how we recognize Israeli Arabs when they walk into the hotel lobby in Amman? So I said, no idea. How do you recognize them? He said, that's easy. I sit there in the lobby and in come, just about. In come, you know, the Saudis, husbands first, wives later. In come the Moroccans, this and that. Each of them have their characteristics. In come the Turkish. And then you see this bunch of people. The women are elbowing their way to the front desk making demands, and the men are all wearing Ray-Ban sunglasses, and people say, these are the Israelis. Maybe it goes deeper. Maybe even in this very sad, unfortunate time for Israeli society, we still have our wet Republican elements, some of them non-verbal, some of them visual. Maybe it's still there, maybe it is a possibility. I would never like the liberal backbone to disappear. There is no republicanism without a liberal backbone. Nor can we have a dry by-the-book republicanism in this society. But we could have, incorporating the Levantine plurality, which is totally gone from the rest of the Middle East, we might be able to build up a new wet republicanism, far broader than its previous one. And this wetness that I'm talking about can either become, tragically, the wetness of bloodshed, or more happily, the wetness of a new, highly creative concoction. Thank you.